Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you tales that touch the heart and inspire the soul. Today's story takes you on a transformative journey of redemption, love, and the power of compassion. What happens when a renowned but cold-hearted doctor crosses paths with a little girl fighting for her life? As their lives intertwine, the lessons they teach each other go far beyond medicine. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to follow more moving stories like this. And join us as we begin today's heartfelt tale. Stay tuned for an unforgettable story that might just change the way you see the world. Dr. David Carter was a man defined by his reputation. He was brilliant, meticulous, and utterly unsympathetic. At Harper Memorial Hospital, he was a towering figure. His name whispered in awe and trepidation. He had saved more lives than anyone could count. But he had also left a trail of bitterness in his wake, each sharp word and cold dismissal etching scars on those who worked beside him. On any given day, you could find him in the operating room, commanding his team like a general in battle. His piercing blue eyes, framed by wire-rimmed glasses, missed nothing. Today was no exception. He stood over an open chest cavity, his gloved hands moving with the kind of precision that could only come from decades of experience. The beeping of the heart monitor provided a tense rhythm as he navigated the delicate terrain of a human heart. "Thompson," he snapped, his voice slicing through the room like a scalpel. "I've told you before, hold the retractor properly. Do you want to ruin this procedure?" The young intern, her hands trembling, muttered an apology, sweat dripping from her brow. The nurses exchanged glances, silently praying that they wouldn't be the next target of his ire. "Sorry doesn't save lives," Dr. Carter barked, his focus never wavering from his work. "Perfection does. Excellence does. And mediocrity kills." Despite the harshness of his words, there was no denying his skill. Within minutes, the intricate repair was complete, the heart now beating steadily on its own. A nurse announced the patient's stability, her voice tinged with relief. Dr. Carter stripped off his gloves and mask with a sharp, practiced motion, barely acknowledging the success. "Close him up," he said curtly, already striding out of the operating room. Behind him, the tension dissolved as the team exhaled collectively. The young intern slumped against the counter, fighting back tears. In the pristine corridors of the hospital, Dr. Carter's presence was both magnetic and repelling. His crisp white coat swayed as he walked with purpose, ignoring the cheerful greetings of nurses and the hopeful waves of young patients. For him, the hospital was a battlefield, not a place for pleasantries. "Dr. Carter," a voice called out. It was Lisa Morgan, a veteran nurse whose warm demeanor often softened the edges of the hospital's sterility. She hurried to catch up, holding a patient's chart. "Could you take a look at Mr. Rodriguez's case? He needs surgery, but he's uninsured." "We're not a charity." Dr. Carter cut her off without breaking stride. "Send him to County General." Lisa faltered, her expression falling. She opened her mouth to argue but stopped as Dr. Carter's cold gaze met hers. His decision was final. Moments later, a commotion near the hospital's entrance drew everyone's attention. A group of board members had gathered, their voices buzzing with excitement. Dr. Carter paused, his curiosity piqued. Through the automatic doors walked James Harper, the hospital's newly appointed CEO. His tailored suit spoke of wealth, but his warm smile radiated humility. The staff whispered among themselves, awed by his presence. But what truly captured their attention was the young girl at his side, Emily Harper. Emily was a picture of innocence, her bright eyes wide with curiosity as she clutched a small gift wrapped in colorful paper. Her worn cardigan hung loosely on her slender frame, a testament to the simplicity James had insisted on maintaining in their lives despite his wealth. As James bent down to embrace his daughter, the onlookers couldn't help but smile at the tenderness of the moment. Dr. Carter stood apart, observing with a detached expression. This was a man who could repair a heart with precision but had long forgotten how to open his own. As James and Emily disappeared into the crowd, Dr. Carter turned away, retreating to the sterile solitude of his office. The day continued as usual until Emily, wandering the labyrinthine corridors, found herself outside the staff lounge. Clutching her carefully wrapped gift, she hesitated before pushing the door open, thinking perhaps her father might be inside. The lounge was warm, filled with the hum of conversation and the rich aroma of coffee. But as Emily stepped in, her foot caught on the threshold. She stumbled, and in an instant, collided with Dr. Carter, who was engrossed in patient files. His coffee spilled, drenching the papers and staining his immaculate white coat. The room fell silent as all eyes turned to the scene. Dr. Carter's face darkened, his fury barely contained. Emily's small hands trembled as she reached out to help. "I'm so sorry," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "Please, let me help. Don't touch anything." Dr. Carter's voice thundered, slapping her hands away. The sound echoed in the silence, as sharp and cutting as a scalpel. "Haven't you done enough? Who let you in here? This is a hospital, not a daycare." Emily's lip quivered, tears welling up in her wide eyes. She clutched her gift tightly to her chest, her small frame shrinking under his towering figure. "Get out," he barked, his voice filled with disdain. "And next time, try wearing something that doesn't look like it came from a dumpster." The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Emily fled, her sobs barely suppressed. The nurses rushed to the doorway, calling after her, but she was already gone. In that moment, the fortress of Dr. Carter's reputation began to crack. Though he didn't yet realize it, the seeds of his reckoning had been sown. And soon, the cold precision he had relied on for so long would no longer be enough. Emily ran through the hospital's maze-like hallways, her small shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Her cherished gift, wrapped so carefully, now felt like a heavy burden in her hands. She turned a corner and found herself in a quiet waiting room, slumping onto a chair in the farthest corner. Her tears flowed freely now, staining the faded fabric of her cardigan. Two nurses noticed her, their concerned gazes softening as they approached. One was an older woman named Ruth, with a kind face framed by graying hair. The other was Melanie, a younger nurse whose gentle smile hid her own inexperience in dealing with such situations. Ruth knelt beside Emily, offering a tissue and a soft, comforting hand on her back. There, sweetheart," Ruth said, her voice soothing. "What happened?" Emily struggled to find her voice, hiccuping as she tried to explain. I just wanted to give my dad a gift. But I spilled coffee on a doctor's papers. And he was so mad." Ruth exchanged a glance with Melanie, who was already reaching for her phone. "Your dad?" Melanie asked gently, crouching to meet Emily's tear-filled eyes. "Who's your dad?" "Sweetheart. Mr. Harper," Emily whispered, clutching the gift tighter. "The new CEO." Both nurses froze for a moment, their expressions a mix of shock and sympathy. Melanie quickly sent a text to James Harper, knowing he would want to know about his daughter's distress. Ruth stayed with Emily, her hand still rubbing soothing circles on the girl's back. Meanwhile, James Harper was in a meeting with the hospital's board when his phone buzzed. He read the message, his brow furrowing as he excused himself and rushed to find Emily. When he entered the waiting room minutes later, his heart clenched at the sight of his daughter's tear-streaked face. "Daddy," Emily whispered, her voice breaking as fresh tears welled in her eyes. She reached for him, and he crossed the room in 3 long strides. Kneeling to embrace her, he held her tightly, his jaw clenched as he tried to mask his rising anger. "What happened, sweetheart?" James asked softly, his tone calm but firm. As the nurses recounted the incident, his expression hardened. When they described Dr. Carter's words and actions, a cold fury settled in his eyes. He hit your hands away. James's voice was dangerously quiet. Emily nodded, sniffling as she clung to his lapel. I just wanted to help clean up the papers. James exhaled slowly, his lips pressing into a thin line. Stay with these kind nurses for a moment. Emily, he said gently, kissing the top of her head. I need to have a word with Dr. Carter. In the staff lounge, the atmosphere had returned to normal, save for the coffee-stained papers stacked haphazardly in the trash. Dr. Carter stood by the coffee machine, now wearing a fresh white coat, his irritation barely concealed as he reviewed another set of files. The staff around him moved cautiously, their unease palpable. When the door opened, every head turned as James Harper stepped inside. His presence, commanding yet calm, sent a ripple of tension through the room. Dr. Carter looked up briefly before returning to his papers, clearly unimpressed. Dr. Carter, James said, his voice steady but firm. I understand there was an incident here earlier. Dr. Carter barely glanced up. A minor disturbance, he replied dismissively. Some unattended child wandered in where she didn't belong and created quite a mess. James's expression didn't change, but his tone dropped, each word carrying weight. That unattended child, he said slowly, is my daughter. The color drained from Dr. Carter's face as he froze, his coffee cup trembling in his hand. Around them, the room fell silent, the staff watching with wide eyes. The fortress of Dr. Carter's arrogance had just been breached, and the consequences were only beginning. James Harper's calm but commanding presence filled the room as he took a deliberate step closer to Dr. Carter, his voice unwavering. And I, he continued, am James Harper. As of this morning, I own this hospital. The words hung in the air, their impact as sharp as a slap. Dr. Carter's arrogant facade began to crack. His coffee cup clattered into the sink. Forgotten. As he struggled to form a response, the staff around them exchanged uneasy glances, unsure whether to stay or flee the charged atmosphere. That little girl you humiliated, James said, his voice still controlled but colder now, came here today to surprise me with a gift. A gift she made herself, wearing a cardigan that belonged to her late mother. And you slapped her hands away as though she were nothing. Dr. Carter opened his mouth, but no sound came out. His usual sharp wit and cutting retorts failed him. James's piercing gaze held him in place, leaving no room for excuses or empty apologies. Mr. Harper, Dr. Carter finally managed, his tone wavering as he attempted to regain some semblance of control. I had no idea she was your daughter. And that, James interrupted sharply, is the problem. It shouldn't matter who she is. Would it have been acceptable to treat anyone else's daughter that way? Dr. Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. He glanced around the room, seeking even a shred of support, but found none. The staff's disapproving stares made it clear he was on his own. I'll see you in the boardroom in 1 hour, James said curtly. We will be discussing your future here. Without waiting for a response, James turned and walked out of the room, his footsteps echoing in the stunned silence. Behind him, the remaining staff erupted into hushed murmurs, their voices carrying a mix of shock and satisfaction. The untouchable Dr. Carter, it seemed, had finally met his reckoning. An hour later, the hospital's conference room was filled with stern faces and palpable tension. Dr. Carter sat stiffly at the long mahogany table, his usual confidence replaced by a faint sheen of nervousness. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, spotlighting him as though he were a defendant on trial. James Harper stood at the head of the table, his authoritative presence commanding the room. Dr. Carter's behavior today, James began, his voice calm but resolute, was not only unprofessional but outright cruel. This hospital prides itself on compassion and dignity for all who walk through our doors. What happened earlier directly contradicts those values. Dr. Carter cleared his throat, attempting to maintain a shred of his usual superiority. "With all due respect, Mr. Harper," he said, his voice tight. "This feels excessive for a misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" James's tone sharpened. Witnesses described it as a pattern of dismissive and abrasive behavior. Not just a single incident. Several board members nodded in agreement. Dr. Carter's confidence wavered further as he realized the extent of his precarious position. James's final words were firm and decisive. "Effective immediately. Dr. Carter, you are suspended pending a full review of these complaints. Security will assist you in clearing out your office." Dr. Carter sat motionless as the room emptied around him, the weight of his actions finally sinking in. His once celebrated career now hung by the thinnest of threads. Dr. Carter returned to his penthouse apartment that evening, his mind a turbulent storm of anger and humiliation. The elevator ride to the top floor felt suffocating, the walls pressing closer with each passing second. When he finally stepped through his front door, he flung his briefcase across the room, watching it crash against a cabinet. Papers spilled onto the floor, but he ignored them, his breath ragged with frustration. "How dare they?" he muttered, pacing across the sleek marble floors. The hospital had been his domain, his sanctuary. For 2 decades, his surgical expertise had saved lives and commanded respect. And now, reduced to this, suspended like some negligent intern, his fists clenched tightly at his sides, he stopped in front of a side table, where a row of crystal awards gleamed under the soft glow of a designer lamp. His eyes landed on a particular plaque, one awarded for groundbreaking achievements in cardiac surgery. Without thinking, he picked it up and hurled it at the fireplace. The shattering sound reverberated through the room, filling the silence that followed. Dr. Carter sank into a leather armchair, his head in his hands. His chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. Then, as the adrenaline ebbed, something else began to seep in, an ache he couldn't suppress. He sat for a long time, staring at the pieces of shattered glass on the floor. On the edge of the coffee table, half buried under mail and hospital documents, lay a photo frame. Dr. Carter reached for it with trembling hands and wiped the dust from the glass. A young girl with pigtails smiled back at him, her gap-toothed grin lighting up the photo. His daughter, Ellie. Her 9th birthday. The memory hit him like a blow. He remembered that day so clearly, the cake she'd insisted on baking herself. The laughter when they'd cut it and found the inside still gooey. And the phone call that had come moments later, summoning him back to the hospital. He'd left Ellie at the kitchen table, her face falling as he promised to make it up to her. Except he hadn't. The years had passed in a blur of surgeries and long hours. And one by one, Ellie's calls had grown less frequent until they stopped entirely. It had been over 5 years since he'd heard her voice. Dr. Carter set the frame down with care, his hands suddenly too weak to hold it. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes, exhaustion washing over him. Images of Ellie merged with the memory of little Lily Harper's tear-streaked face. The parallels were stark, impossible to ignore. For the first time in years, Dr. Carter allowed himself to wonder, had he become the man Ellie always feared he would? The thought settled in his chest like a weight, making it hard to breathe. The next morning, Dr. Carter arrived at the hospital with a sense of dread he couldn't shake. He had barely slept, haunted by memories of Ellie and the echo of Lily's trembling voice. The towering facade of St. Joseph's felt less like a haven and more like a fortress, one where he no longer belonged. His footsteps faltered as he reached the pediatric wing. The bright murals of animals and rainbows that adorned the walls were an assault on his carefully maintained stoicism. Children's laughter echoed down the hallway, a stark contrast to the sterile silence of the surgical floor he was used to. He clenched his jaw and pushed forward, determined to fulfill the terms of his reassignment with as little disruption to his routine as possible. In the first room he entered, a young boy named Max sat propped up in bed, his superhero cape draped over his frail shoulders. The chart in Dr. Carter's hands detailed Max's ongoing battle with leukemia, a fight marked by grueling rounds of chemotherapy. As Dr. Carter adjusted his stethoscope and prepared to examine the boy, Max's bright eyes locked onto him. "Are you a real doctor?" Max asked, his tone more curious than accusatory. "Yes," Dr. Carter replied curtly, leaning in to listen to the boy's lungs. His focus remained on the task, his movements mechanical. Max wrinkled his nose. "You don't look like a kid doctor. Dr. Sarah always wears funny ties." Dr. Carter straightened, his expression impassive. "I'm here to make sure you're healthy, not to entertain you." Max's face fell, and he pulled his cape tighter around himself. "I miss Dr. Sarah," he whispered. The words stung more than Dr. Carter expected, though he quickly pushed the feeling aside. "You'll be just fine," he said briskly, before walking out of the room. But the image of Max's disappointed expression lingered. As the day wore on, Dr. Carter struggled to find his footing in this unfamiliar world. The pediatric wing operated on a different rhythm, one that valued compassion and connection as much as clinical skill. Nurses sang songs to distract children from needles. Parents clutched stuffed animals as tightly as their kids, and laughter seemed to flow as freely as tears. At lunchtime, Dr. Carter retreated to his office, hoping for a moment of solitude. But even there, the sound of children playing carried through the walls, tugging at something deep inside him. He thought of Ellie again, of the times he'd prioritized surgeries over her recitals, emergencies over her birthdays. The memories were relentless, each one cutting deeper than the last. For years, he had justified his choices with the mantra that saving lives came first. But now, surrounded by children who needed more than just a surgeon, he wondered if he had been wrong. As he sat there, staring at the blank pages of a notebook, a thought emerged unbidden. This wasn't just a punishment. It was a chance to remember why he became a doctor in the first place. The following day, Dr. Carter entered the pediatric wing with the same trepidation. But this time, he paused before stepping into his first patient's room. He took a deep breath, reminding himself to soften his tone, to be present. These kids, he realized, didn't just need medicine, they needed reassurance. His first stop was Emma's room. She was 3 years old, her tiny body almost swallowed by the hospital bed. Her big brown eyes stared up at him with a mix of curiosity and fear as she clutched a battered stuffed bunny to her chest. "Good morning, Emma," he said, his voice gentler than usual. He crouched slightly, so he was at eye level with her. "Can Mr. Bunny help me check your heartbeat?" Emma hesitated, her small hands tightening around the toy. "Does it hurt?" she whispered. "Not at all," Dr. Carter assured her. He reached into his pocket and produced a bright yellow sticker shaped like a star. "And Mr. Bunny can have a sticker when we're done." Emma's eyes lit up, and she slowly handed over her stuffed animal. Dr. Carter placed the stethoscope against its fuzzy chest first, pretending to listen. "Mr. Bunny sounds very healthy," he said with a small smile. Then, carefully, he checked Emma's heart, his movements slow and deliberate. When he finished, he handed her the sticker and gave Mr. Bunny a gentle pat on the head. "You're both doing great." Emma giggled softly, a sound that filled the sterile room with warmth. For the first time in years, Dr. Carter felt a flicker of something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: connection. As the morning went on, he noticed the way the staff interacted with the children. Nurse Rachel, with her ever-present smile, sat cross-legged on the floor with a group of kids, playing an animated game of Go Fish. Dr. Carter observed her from a distance, marveling at her ability to balance care and playfulness. He was brought back to reality by a tug on his coat. Lily stood there, her expression serious. In her hands, she held a carefully folded piece of paper. "I made this for you," she said. Dr. Carter unfolded the paper to find a crayon drawing of himself, complete with his white coat and a big red heart in the middle of his chest. Above the drawing, In shaky handwriting were the words, "Best doctor." His throat tightened. "Thank you, Lily," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. "This means a lot." Lily smiled and skipped away, leaving him holding the drawing like a lifeline. It wasn't just a child's art, it was a reminder that he could be more than the cold, unapproachable surgeon he had allowed himself to become. Later that evening, as he sat in his office staring at the drawing, Dr. Carter felt the weight of his past choices pressing down on him. He realized he had spent so much time building walls to protect himself that he'd forgotten how to let people in. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. Dr. Carter began the next morning with more clarity than he'd felt in years. The crayon drawing from Lily had stayed with him, tucked safely into his coat pocket like a talisman. The image of the heart she'd drawn in bright red seemed to mirror something inside him, something he hadn't dared to acknowledge until now. His rounds took him back to the room of Sammy, the 8-year-old boy battling leukemia. Sammy's bright smile greeted him, though it faltered when Dr. Carter entered. "Hey, champ," Dr. Carter said, pulling up a chair next to Sammy's bed. "How are we feeling today?" Sammy shrugged. "Okay, I guess." He fiddled with the hem of his blanket before looking up. "Do you think I'll be better soon?" Dr. Carter hesitated. He had always avoided such personal questions, preferring clinical detachment. But today, he felt compelled to respond differently. "I think you're one of the bravest kids I've ever met," he said softly. "And being brave is the first step to getting better." Sammy's face lit up, and he nodded, seeming to draw strength from the words. As Dr. Carter stood to leave, Sammy called after him, "Dr. Carter?" "Yes." "Sammy, do doctors ever get scared?" The question stopped him in his tracks. He turned back, meeting Sammy's curious gaze. "Sometimes," Dr. Carter admitted, his voice quiet. "But being scared doesn't mean you can't be strong too." Sammy nodded, satisfied with the answer, and returned to his puzzle. Dr. Carter left the room, the weight of the boy's innocent question settling on him. Do doctors get scared? He had spent years running from his fears, burying them under his professional facade. But now, it seemed those fears were surfacing, demanding to be faced. Later that day, while reviewing charts in his office, his thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. He looked up to see Nurse Rachel standing there, holding a cup of coffee. "You're different lately," she said, handing him the cup without preamble. "Not the same surgeon who walked into this ward a few weeks ago." Dr. Carter gave a small, self-deprecating laugh. "I suppose working here has a way of changing people." Rachel nodded, her expression softening. "It's not just about medicine here. These kids, their families, they need more than a doctor. They need someone who cares." Her words stayed with him throughout the day. That evening, he found himself sitting in the hospital's garden, gazing at the setting sun. For years, he had been so consumed by his ambition and the ghosts of his past that he had forgotten what it meant to truly connect with others. Now, as he thought about Sammy's courage, Lily's drawing, and Rachel's words, he began to see a path forward not just as a doctor, but as a person. For the first time in a long time, Dr. Carter felt a glimmer of hope that he could become someone worthy of the trust and admiration these children so freely gave. And maybe, just maybe, he could finally make peace with his past. The pediatric ward hummed with the quiet sounds of nurses working and children playing. Dr. Carter walked the familiar hallways, stopping occasionally to chat with staff or peek into a patient's room. The vibrant murals on the walls, once an assault on his sense of order, now felt like an essential part of the ward's identity, a reflection of the life and hope within its walls. His next stop was Lily's room. She was sitting upright in bed, her small hands busy with a new craft project. A pair of scissors and a rainbow of construction paper were spread out before her. "Good morning, Lily," Dr. Carter greeted, leaning against the doorframe. "What are you working on today?" Lily looked up and beamed at him, holding up a carefully cut paper heart. "I'm making thank you cards for all the nurses and doctors," she said. "This one's for Nurse Rachel." Dr. Carter smiled, his heart warming at the simple act of kindness. "That's very thoughtful of you. I'm sure she'll love it." "Do you want one too?" she asked, tilting her head. "I could make you a really big one," he chuckled, stepping closer to her bed. "I'd be honored." Lily. As she busied herself with the paper and glue, Dr. Carter sat in the chair beside her bed, watching her work. Her hands moved with precision, her face scrunched in concentration. The innocence of her actions reminded him of his daughter, Sarah, when she was Lily's age. "Dr. Carter," Lily said suddenly, not looking up, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," he replied, folding his hands in his lap. "Were you always a nice doctor?" Her question was so direct, so honest, that it caught him off guard. He hesitated, then sighed. "No, Lily, I wasn't. I used to be different. I cared more about being the best than about how I made people feel." Lily glanced up at him, her big eyes curious. "What changed?" Dr. Carter thought for a moment, his gaze distant. "Someone reminded me that being a good doctor isn't just about fixing hearts. It's about caring for the people who have them." Lily nodded as if she understood. "I think you're a good doctor now." Her words struck something deep within him. He reached out and gently patted her hand. "Thank you, Lily. That means more than you know." Later that afternoon, Dr. Carter stood outside his office, gazing at the bustling ward. He thought about the impact these children had on him, their strength and resilience shining even in the face of adversity. He saw how their innocence and honesty had forced him to confront the person he had become and inspired him to change. That evening, as he sat in his quiet apartment, he pulled out a photo of Sarah. For the first time in years, he didn't feel the sting of regret as sharply. Instead, he felt a small flicker of hope. He picked up his phone and dialed her number, his heart racing as it rang. When the call went to voicemail, he left a simple message. "Sarah, it's Dad. I'd really love to talk to you. Please call me back." Hanging up, he leaned back in his chair, a mixture of nerves and relief washing over him. It wasn't much, but it was a start. And for Dr. Carter, starting again was the hardest and most important step of all. The next morning, Dr. Carter walked into the pediatric ward with a renewed sense of purpose. The once daunting atmosphere of laughter and bright colors now felt like home. He was greeted by Sammy, who was sitting in his wheelchair, holding a comic book. "Dr. Carter," Sammy called out, waving enthusiastically. "Guess what? I walked 5 steps yesterday." Dr. Carter crouched down to Sammy's level, his face lighting up with pride. 5 steps. That's amazing. "Sammy, you're turning into a superhero." Sammy grinned, lifting his comic book. "I think I need a cape, though. We'll have to get you one," Dr. Carter said, patting Sammy's shoulder. "Every superhero needs a cape." As the day progressed, Dr. Carter moved from room to room, checking on his young patients. Each interaction carried a sense of authenticity and care that had once been absent in his work. He listened more, not just to their medical concerns but to their stories, their fears, and their dreams. When he reached Lily's room, he found her fast asleep, clutching the thank you card she had made for him. The paper heart she'd glued onto the front was slightly crooked, but the words inside were what moved him. "Thank you for being the best doctor ever. You make my heart happy." Dr. Carter quietly took a seat by her bed, letting the moment sink in. Her words echoed in his mind, a reminder of how far he had come not just as a doctor, but as a person. He thought about his early days at the hospital, when his pride and arrogance had built walls between him and everyone around him. Those walls were crumbling now, replaced by bridges of empathy and connection. In the hallway, he ran into Grace Thompson, Eli's mother. She looked radiant, her face glowing with relief and gratitude. Dr. Carter, she said, her voice brimming with emotion. I just wanted to thank you again. Eli's doing so well. And it's because of you. Dr. Carter shook his head. You don't have to thank me, Grace. You and Eli did all the hard work. Grace smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. You don't understand. It wasn't just the medical care. You gave us hope when we didn't have any. That's something I'll never forget. Her words stayed with him throughout the day. They reminded him of Benjamin's own gratitude after Ashley's surgery and the profound impact of the trust they had placed in him. It wasn't just about the skills he had perfected in the operating room, it was about the lives he touched beyond it. As the sun set, Dr. Carter found himself at the wall of children's artwork in the pediatric wing. His eyes were drawn to Ashley's drawing of him, the one with the bright red heart in the center. Below it, someone had added a small plaque, the Heart of Healing. He reached out, his fingers brushing the edge of the frame. For the first time, he truly understood the weight of those words. Healing wasn't just about mending broken bodies, it was about restoring faith, building connections, and creating a space where love and care could thrive. Dr. Carter stood there for a long time, the sounds of the ward fading into the background. He wasn't just a surgeon anymore. He was a healer, in every sense of the word. And he knew he had finally found his true calling. The day of Ashley's discharge arrived, and the pediatric wing buzzed with a bittersweet energy. Nurses and staff gathered in the playroom, which had been transformed into a festive space filled with balloons and colorful decorations. A large banner read, "We'll miss you, Ashley." Ashley entered the room in her wheelchair, pushed by her father, Benjamin. Her cheeks were rosy, her eyes bright, a stark contrast to the pale, fragile girl who had first arrived at the hospital months ago. She wore a bright yellow dress and the wooden heart locket that Dr. Carter had carved for her, which rested proudly around her neck. The children cheered as she entered, clapping and waving. Sammy rolled up in his wheelchair, presenting her with a bouquet of hand-picked flowers from the hospital garden. "You're going to do great, Ashley," he said with a wide grin. Ashley beamed, holding the flowers close. "Thank you, Sammy. I'll miss you all so much." The room fell quiet as Benjamin stood to address the gathered crowd. "Today, we're celebrating more than Ashley's recovery," he began, his voice thick with emotion. "We're celebrating the incredible people who made it possible, the nurses, the staff, and especially Dr. Carter." He gestured toward Dr. Carter, who stood at the back of the room, trying his best to blend into the crowd. All eyes turned to him, and a ripple of applause spread through the room. Dr. Carter's usual composure faltered, and he stepped forward, clearing his throat. "I'm honored to have been part of Ashley's journey," he said, his voice uncharacteristically soft. He turned to Ashley, his expression warm. "But honestly, Ashley, you've taught me more than I ever taught you. You reminded me why I became a doctor in the first place." Ashley smiled, her small hands clasping the locket around her neck. "You're the best doctor ever, Dr. Carter," she said earnestly. "And you're part of my lucky heart." Her words drew quiet murmurs of approval from the crowd, and Dr. Carter felt a lump rise in his throat. He stepped closer to Ashley and handed her a small box. "I made something for you," he said. Inside the box was another carved wooden charm, shaped like a star. "For all the new adventures you're about to have, let this remind you that you're stronger than you know." Ashley's eyes lit up as she accepted the gift. Without hesitation, she leaned forward and hugged him tightly. "Thank you for everything," she whispered. Dr. Carter hugged her back, his heart full. As he released her, she reached out to take her father's hand. Together, they made their way toward the exit, stopping to say goodbye to everyone along the way. Dr. Carter watched them leave, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and gratitude. He had found his purpose, not just in healing bodies but in transforming lives. And as he looked around the playroom filled with laughter and hope, he knew that this was where he belonged. Thank you for joining us for this heartwarming journey of transformation, love, and redemption. Stories like these remind us of the profound impact compassion can have on our lives and the lives of those around us. If you enjoyed today's tale, don't forget to subscribe to our channel to stay updated on more inspiring stories that touch the heart. We'd love to hear your thoughts. So leave a comment and let us know what moved you the most. Until next time, keep spreading kindness. And we'll see you again soon with another unforgettable story on Life Stories.